Hello, welcome to the seminar today. My name is Juliet Chastney, Project Manager for the LiSHoRe project. Welcome. This webinar is Voicing Diverse Spiritual and Religious Needs, the difficulty of discussing spirituality and religion at work. It's great to have you here today. If you'd like to quickly say hello in the question and answer section and say where you're from while I'm speaking, that would be great. This is the second in a series of 6 webinars on topics relating to spirituality and religion as experienced by ethnically diverse NHS staff during the COVID-19 pandemic. These webinars are part of the LiSHoRe project, which is a study funded by NHS England, and we have been conducting consultation groups with ethnically diverse NHS staff up and down the country to explore their experiences and guide us towards the topics for these webinars. How today's event will work is our speakers will have a discussion with each other for the first 30 minutes or so. Then we will open up to questions and answers. Everyone attending this webinar has their camera turned off and their microphone on mute. If you would like to ask a question of our speakers, please type into the Q&A section and the questions will be moderated by Sophise, who you will see a bit more of later. Please type your questions in as soon as you think of them while we're still talking, as there is a delay before we can respond. All of these webinars are being recorded and will be available on the webpage later. Our speaker for today is Abdullah Shahjan, who has been a senior chaplain and imam for over 2 decades. He is also in private practice as an Eastern psychologist and psychotherapist. He is autistic and has ADHD with numerous disabilities, all of which aid him in his work and recreation. Abdullah has led international expeditions in Africa, Albania, Kosovo and Pakistan, working with NGOs supporting victims of trauma and war. He is readily invited on national and local radio and media to share his expertise and experience. He continues to advise the Home Office and parliamentary advisory groups in specialist areas and was amongst pioneers who brought the Wellbeing Recovery Action Plan, WRAP, to the UK. Thank you for being with us today, Abdullah. Joining him in conversation is Reverend Dr. Guy Harrison, Director of the Oxford Centre for Spirituality and Wellbeing and Project Lead for the LiSHoRe project. Over to you, Guy and Abdullah.
Thank you very much, Juliet, and can I add my welcome to Abdullah to this webinar. Thank you so much for giving your time. And I believe you're in the largest NHS trust in Europe, with, I think, possibly the largest chaplaincy team. So I'm very envious in that sense, but really look forward to hearing what you're going to say to us. I wonder if we could perhaps just start by perhaps you could describe something about your context and your work, both as an imam and working in such an acute and challenging context, but with the whole kind of subject and area of diversity and the difficulty that we often find of discussing spirituality and religion at work. Perhaps you could just give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and something of the dilemmas that is you've seen them in your own particular context.
Thank you, John and Juliet. Thank you, Guy and Juliet, for asking me to attend this seminar. It's an absolute privilege and pleasure. To give context, we live in incredible times, and I say that with a great sense of thought around, actually, we have never faced the things we're facing in our lifetimes, that we are now facing as a community of people and as a civilization, if you like. So one of the greatest things around for me is actually working with people from all over the world who have their own worldview and multiple layers of culture, thought processes, protocols, and ideas. So when we work with people with such diversity across different groups, it's a complex situation. And so as I came to this trust in 2019 at Manchester University Hospital Trust, I was really honoured that actually they thought that actually I could lead such a great team. And quite rightly, Guy, I do take pride in saying that it's one of the largest teams in UK and in Europe, and actually modern healthcare, spiritual and chaplaincy world. We have a great challenge, I think, in chaplaincy and spiritual care and generally in healthcare, especially as it functions in a state reality, because our trusts are obliged to fulfill the responsibility of providing a service to people when it comes to health. Now, this is a new reality if we look at history. So, before, a lot of organizations, hospitals, and were charitable institutions which were independent of the state. So throughout history, we saw institutions develop. They existed in their own right as trusts and organizations, and they may have been sponsored by endowment funds all over. We know that throughout Africa, Middle East, and Asia, that was the case in ashrams. We knew that was the case in the Middle East with the mustashfa. So there's some words I'll be saying that are synonymous today as the word hospital. But just to give you context, the word mustashfa is a place of healing. And ashrams were used as a place for people to realign themselves to find health and healing. And now we come to a time when we have a state entity involved in the care of people with ill health. So the discussion then becomes actually what is possible when a state provision comes into play. That's one point. And then what happens when we have such a diverse set of circumstance of people that we serve, people who are serving, and the people who are involved in all of that. They're from the porters to the domestic staff, to the clinicians, and to those all allied health professionals. So much is going on, so diverse. So coming back to your question, context-wise, it's a very complicated set of scenarios we're working with.
Thanks, Abdullah. And in that sense, the complexity, I guess it means that we find it very difficult to know where we belong or how we, in terms of our own identity as a person, and particularly for those of our colleagues who are from ethnically diverse backgrounds, the evidence seems to suggest that that's more of a challenge. Would you agree with that?
It's a really interesting question, Guy. I think one of the challenges we face is that there's a lot. If I can use an analogy of a theatre, and that the stage is set with its props, with its stage, and it has its protocols, it has its director leading the play or the theatre that's been enacted. The challenge is, how do you come on to that theatre stage if you don't know what the protocols of that theatre, that play is? There's an assumption we're all coming to the conversation with the same level of understanding, or at least an appreciation that this is how it works. So if you come from a place where actually the conversation around health is a different conversation and a different experience, both medically, clinically, or non-clinically, and you're trying to align yourself with a situation which you don't really know the parameters of, that is a real challenge. So there's almost given assumption that we know how to have this conversation because it's on the same level playing field. And I think that's where my thoughts were when I looked at the topic for this. I thought, well, actually, some of us are going to be observers, some of us are going to be actors and players, and some of us are really trying to unearth what's going off here. And often that's the patient. What's going off for me? But actually, as actors who are involved in supporting the patient, how do we understand that world of the patient, and how does that interplay happen? So that's where I'm at in this conscious mode of this question.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. But I'm struck by the analogy and the image that you give there, and I wonder sometimes there's always a director, isn't there, of a play, there's a producer, and sometimes we're as part of an institution where we're not necessarily on the same page as. I mean, plays will be a disaster if we're not on the same page as the director, or vice versa. But sometimes that can be the case, I guess, in terms of diversity. We don't feel as if we fit.
Yeah. So I'll give you a classic example. Sorry to interject, Guy. Just that the example of our values. So we may have a number of words that describe the behaviors and values of our organization. I'll take one word, for example, respect. Now, when you ask a group of people and you ask them what respect means for those individuals, you normally get a really interesting response, quite different from each other, but with some common threads. So if something so powerful as the word respect is actually understood differently on different layers, and that's just one word, one value that we have as an organization, what is the work that needs to, what do we need to do and undergo around really unpacking the way we see the world together? Because I often talk about the director's cut. So when you watch a film and it's the director's cut version, it is his or her version of the film. Now, when we come together and we've got this mission and aim, and the mission and aim statement is clear, but how do we sail together to the same point? We might be on different yachts or ships or boats, and we're heading towards the North Pole, but actually we take different routes. That's the complexity that we have of trying to bring people of different thought, different practice, different beings, different realities, as well as the experience that we have.
And so in that sense, is it about celebrating the difference and celebrating diversity and I guess before celebrating, one has to recognize that there is that difference first, and to see it and to own it and to understand it. Does that seem fair?
I think that's really, I think there's more to that. There's Plato says that everything has a beginning and the beginning is intent. And I often, what intent do we establish our mission, our statements, our values with? And that precursor is really important to the conversation. We all attend this seminar today, but we all come with hopes, aspirations, questions. But actually, how many of us of our intents, brought us to this point? So sometimes not necessarily you need to know the intent of or ambition of what we're trying to achieve. Is actually there's more to it. Like you said, there's layers of, I think the challenge is that because there's so many unknowns, there's something around when I travel, and I'm sure people have experienced this. When you travel abroad, there's a beautiful understanding of the quintessential British experience. People want that experience to be experienced when they meet you. That you're going to know the royal family. You're going to know somebody who has something British about them. Now, obviously, that experience isn't the same for every person living on this incredible island. And actually, people came from far throughout the generations, from the Saxons, the Normans, and to later periods. So then we're dealing with such. What keeps coming back to me as you ask the question, Guy, is how do we first actually acknowledge that there is a difference? Because we can celebrate difference, but acknowledging actually that there is something profoundly important around actually what does that belonging and identity look like? What does it mean? So I'll give you an example. A foreign name, a name which is not within the custom of our people and tradition of the land. If you first see that name, I struggle with the name Siobhan because when it's spelled as a dyslexic and autistic person, I don't read it phonetically. I see it and I struggle with the name. But actually, when you hear the name being pronounced, it becomes clear that name means that that word is spelled and spoken and expressed in that way. Now, something as simple as a name, if it's not honored and valued, and that's a massive part of the identity of the individual, if we can't get something basic as the name, valuing that, then there are so many other layers that we have to be challenged with. So I struggle with that in one aspect, because my name is not something which is common. It's common for some communities and for others it's not. So let's just start with, for example, the name is a really important identifier of belonging, and a common identifier, but actually what's behind the name? What's the story? And how many times do we ask that of each other, you know? Sorry, Guy, I think you're muted.
You're quite right. And knowing a person's name, knowing something about a person, giving meaning, giving some identity. You talk to prepare for this session about having multiple identities and multiple ways of thinking and believing. Is that something you'd like to say something more about?
Yeah, so one of the experiences is I was watching one of my favorite shows on the weekend. I watch is the family who moved from Britain to France and rebuild the chateau. I can't remember what it's called now. I'm sure people know it. And there was a profound statement made by the mother the other day to the child. And she said, "My child is more French than they are English now, and they live two lives." And that caught me straight away, thinking, when I was born and brought up in England, in Derby in particular, my forefathers traveled to this by choice. They didn't come in the migration periods. They came through Merchant Navy by choice, and then they settled. And I'm third generation. Now, being brought up in a place where your first language is the language of your parents. So actually, the very first spoken word that I would have spoken is the language of my parents. Now, then you know, the life of nursery reception starts, where you're suddenly immersed into something which actually is about play, but is about forming of language, because you start to hear words that you don't associate with, you don't know, you may recognize them. And then that continues throughout childhood. And then there's experiences in that which we all observe the world based on our experiences to some extent. But when you go home, what actually happens? What is the life that we experience at home compared to the life of our colleagues, friends, teachers and counterparts? How similar, how different is that? And how important is that in the play in terms of in our exchange in a work life? So there'll be a difference in the language. So my children will say, "Dad, you put on this professional voice when you're going to work, and you speak to us at home with a different voice." Just an example. So Dr. Simon Fernandez is a psychiatrist, retired, and he talks about, it's a well-known idea of double consciousness, that you board the train and you behave in one way, and when you leave the train or the underground, you behave another. And you're constantly between these worlds. So some people like to call it compartmentalization of professional identity. But for me, it's about actually how do you, with all those incredible identities, how do you belong and how do you be one? How is it? You know, how do we settle with actually it's okay to be you with all of those zones? But actually, you may, you know, I often sometimes go into my local parlance. I think people remember once when Tony Blair went into a Cockney parlance and people caught onto that because they weren't expecting that of him. So if we see that out in the, you know, there's almost an expectation levied on us that we should be behaving with a protocol, with certain set standards. Now that's difficult if that's not the way you experience life. You're having to immerse yourself. I always find dinner parties very difficult because I don't know which knife and which fork I should be using if there's a number of them. I always watch the other, and I suppose in an autistic way I observe first and then copy others later. So just as an example, so one of those identities is that you're constantly having to almost, I'm going to use this term, it's, I suppose it comes from a mental health background, that you're almost having to be bipolar at two extremes and actually play this thing out. And that can be tiring, it can be exhausting, because when are you really yourself?
And in that sense, when are you really yourself? My goodness, what a question. And the cost of actually not being able to be yourself, I guess, is huge in that sense. And especially then if we're talking about our own, something that's so deep and meaningful, that is part and parcel of who we are, which is perhaps our faith and our belief, our spirituality.
And can we even approach the subject? Because, you know, we're almost told, we are constantly reminded in media, in the papers, in life, that actually religion, your spirituality is a personal agenda. It's a personal thing. Of course it's personal, because we are unique in the reality of the world. But actually, how important is it in the everydayness of our lives, of our ethical choices that we make, of the moral choices we make, of the philosophical choices that we align ourselves with? Now, when we break it down into those subcategories, one can discuss them in a framework. But what I'm saying is, we're not built like that. You know, we're not built to be so compartmentalized that we discuss these things, that we become almost robotic in the fact that, no, leave that, that's not for us to discuss. Sometimes you find a moment where you want to talk about something, and it's not actually necessarily religious or faith oriented, but it has so many of those threads of strands that are linked into it, that actually until you are open and able to discuss it, you're able to unearth the reality of the discussion. I used to have this one academic professor who often used to talk about Nietzsche, and I often say, I often have the discussion. I said, you know, unless we've immersed ourselves in the general experience as well as the specific, we begin to miss a lot of the conversation. There's an assumed conversation we're having. Does that make sense? Or have I confused?
No, it makes sense. So that sense in which we have to be very careful about what we're saying and how we're articulating ourselves. But actually, we need the freedom to be able to be who we are in our multiple identities that we have. I
was just going to say, the struggle is, of course, we always have policies are there and guidelines are there to help and assist us and protect us. But sometimes, actually, when people really struggle not to offend, we are people, we are a nation of people who don't want to offend. You know, we really, whether we're on the bus or sitting in a cafe or in hospital, we try and mind our business unless somebody wants to introduce themselves and, you know, start a conversation. But the nature of us, we are drilled from school, from our communities, not to offend people. And it's not that we want to offend people, it's actually, we're really trying to begin to understand how can we exist. People say coexist. There's only one existence. It's not about coexistence. It's about existing together. And, you know, we're it's like somebody said to me, when I was doing some mindfulness training around eating, and it was, you know, somebody said, well, why can't we just savor the moment? That was the term we used to use when we were eating. But we're finding terms to avoid really just to say what we need to say. And are we mature enough, I suspect is the question for me, as human beings to have these really meaningful conversations without being offended? Because I think the point, a part of the journey is how do we have open conversations without already making an assumption of people's opinion, philosophical and moral judgments.
And I suppose in that sense for me is, so coming back really, how do we do that? And you know, we all have a variety of protected characteristics that are protected under the law. We have our own sense of identity that is based on so many features of self and of family and of faith and belief. And, how do we have those respectful conversations when often as not we find ourselves in a place where, certainly for ethnically diverse staff, as we've discovered, they don't feel that safe necessarily actually to have those conversations, or in a place where they feel terribly welcome?
my immediate thought was to talk about environments, to create not just physical environments and online environments where actually we are beginning to able to express our real sentiments, our real, or the subtleties of what's really been experienced. I think social media has done some really interesting, it's brought us to the fore, that where this discussion, this seminar for me is monumental in that change, because it's about, we're trying to have real, delicate, very subtle, very nuanced conversations that actually are very difficult to have because it's not in the mainstream conversations. We can talk about football or cricket or sports as if it's nothing to be concerned about, and we can have positions very strong or very, very energized, and yet it doesn't take us away from being with each other. But when it comes to something like a moral or philosophical standpoint, it almost becomes really difficult. And that it's across all of the equality strands, because there, at some point we come to a moral judgment about some matter. And how is it that we can have conversations without having, how can we listen? How can we listen to each other? And how can we journey together in that listening? Because it's not about getting to a point, it's about journeying together. As strangers sometimes, and sometimes as companions, sometimes as professionals, to actually the next point in the journey of growth together. So it's creating safe, open environments that we're allowed to do that. Now, there's so much there. I don't think, there's many different points of that. And one is also allowing people to express themselves in different ways. So one of the things I often find is that actually people from different cultures express themselves remarkably in their languages, in their cultures, through oral storytelling, through music, through prose, through poetry, and through the arts. But actually, we try and do that in some ways within an organization which isn't really built for that. So it's almost adding on, like we add on mobile, we buy a telephone service and we add on broadband or whatever. And rather than it being central to the core, that actually all of this is they say that when civilizations fall, it's when their arts and the liberal arts are, dismantling. So if we've not got to the pinnacle of our institution in terms of cultural openness and awareness, there's something around actually how do we honor that? I'm trying to do a concert at Manchester University Trust. Don't know whether I'm going to pull it off, but it's for me it was an ensemble of different world traditions, being able to hear that, experience it, taste it, feel it. Because there's something about sometimes where you live. I mean, I was talking to Juliet just before that Rusholme is, wow, it's just a blast of cultures. And if you've experienced it, you've experienced it. But if you haven't, it can be a shock. And if you've never tasted some of the foods there, you're going to experience some things. So how do we develop this sense of almost the left brain experience, which actually we often talk about training and education, which is all actually part and parcel of what we need to do. But there's something about something tangible as music, something tangible as food, something tangible or something that we can taste and feel that brings us together. I mean, most people, if there's a free food buffet, they're attending the shorts round or the conference. I'm the first. Openly admit that. How do we do it much more creatively than actually? Because every year we have training, but is it producing the openness that actually we can go to the next level? And should we be challenging ourselves to say, actually, this year we've achieved this, what is it we want to achieve next year? And there is a space for that.
Thank you. I love the idea of using the creative arts, and tell us how the concert goes, because those sorts of opportunities there, aren't there, to be able to celebrate diversity and to help us to listen and really listen. There's always the questions of when we disagree or when we find ourselves in that place where we don't understand, and then find ourselves in a place where we actually it becomes hard to communicate. But as you say, that's the cutting edge. That's the place we need to go a bit beyond and say, well, actually, I may be feeling uncomfortable, but actually there's something here I need to be able to find out and discover about myself, about my colleagues and so on. And you know, thinking generally about spirituality, I mean, the other comment I'd make is, of course, in terms of the creative arts and tasting and seeing and discovering for oneself, that's one of the better places, I think, for me to find within music, certainly. Identity. Yeah.
I'm going to just say it's often easier and more, you know, I'm going to use an expression, palatable, because it's something that people can associate with ease without getting too stuck with words. Because, you know, whether it's a painting, whether it's a piece of incredible music, whether it's a piece of word spoken poetry, all of these things have an incredible moving energy and resonance that so there's a language that I have to translate from my traditions to be able to articulate something which is foreign, and that for me is a difficult thing to do. And so when I'm trying to express what I'm trying to express, I'm thinking of the words in different languages, and so I have to first decipher whether actually that's going to be the best description of it. But with the arts and with food and with, you know, with poetry, there's something that everybody experiences, and it's personal and it's moving.
Thank you, Abdullah. And in that sense too, I'm also conscious of just how exhausting, if we're having to translate the time, utterly exhausting. And we've, you know, with so much that sometimes appears to constrain us.
I often give the quick example, I'm conscious of the time, that I have a deaf nephew, and I really did not know how much time is when they're trying to communicate and they are actively trying to understand what's going off. You know, they've expunged all the energy they have, and actually where people with hearing can continue and will have energy, actually people with lack of without hearing, you know, the energy is spent. So similarly, actually, we have all of these subtleties going off for people of other people with multiple realities.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. I think it's probably an opportunity now to go to the questions. Should we hand over to Safis? Could you kind of direct us in terms of the first question?
I can indeed. We have a couple of questions from the Worcestershire area. So the first question is, I like the analogue of different boats to get to the North Pole. Can you elaborate who decides on the boats and why we end up in those different boats, some being more secure than others, if not luxurious? How can we ensure equity of that travel? And I will put this one to Abdullah first.
Gosh, I suppose what I heard last of the question was the equity, and how do we? So if you've ever boarded, okay, if you have a car or a bus or you travel on any plane, you, according to your capacity, usually due to financial capacity, you board the plane at different parts of the plane. So there's already a protocol put in place. So people already have a culture that's already almost given advantage. So when we talk about equity, nobody's going to be traveling at the same pace, even though the water and the waves of the seas will take you to the North Pole. What you have is actually, for me, it's how do you communicate with each other so that you all reach there at a certain point on the journey. And some of us may reach there later, some of us may reach there earlier, but it's actually how do we keep communicating that actually this is what we're facing, this is what we need, this is what's happening, so we get a fuller picture. And for me, it is about the doing, the listening, and actually making choices collectively for all of us, rather than actually saying, in this boat, we're going to do this because we need to get there faster. And there is times when organizations will choose that for an organization and say that we need to get this X, Y, and Z because actually we've got things that need to be sorted out. Now, when you do make those calls, everything has a consequence. Anything we do has a consequence. So we make the best judgment call based on that. Sometimes it's not always to the benefit of the group or the individuals or the place that we're going to. So there's something around actually looking at it differently, looking at it and saying, actually, some of us might never reach the North Pole. But what does that mean? How do we remain connected? And if we lose some people, sadly, on the journey, how does that loss influence our journey going forward?
If I may, just to come in there, just to also just observe that actually often as not, I mean, we've often used the analogy in the pandemic of being in different boats, but with the rough seas. It's the weather that we have to work out and look out for. I think that's often the case as well. So Sophie, sorry, you wanted to ask another question.
Okay. Second part. In your view, what needs to happen at work for us to feel free enough to be what you are calling being yourself? Again to Abdullah.
Robert Bly has a book called I and John and Sleeping Society, and he's talking to men about men and masculinity. And why I raised the topic is all of us have a journey for self-realization. Now that journey for some is early on in life, and for some it happens, for some it doesn't, for some later on in life. So until we come to our own self. So there's a saying amongst the Sufis, if you want to know your Lord, know yourself. So the idea is that first of all, we have to come to know ourselves so that we can be ourselves. But that's hard because there's so many veneers and layers that we have to lift off and actually just be us, be ourselves. And that's difficult because if you go home, if you experience some form of prejudice every day, microaggressions, it reaffirms those things around I can't be myself. It reaffirms actually I'm not wanted. I give a really pertinent example. When I fly abroad, I come back home to England, and England is my home. When I arrive at the airport, I always feel like a stranger. And I can't tell you why that experience is the case. Why is it that actually in that moment where I arrive at the airport, I'm always seen as a stranger, not as somebody from England? Now, if you're living with that all your life and you unconsciously, you don't even know that's happening, and then you come to that conscious point, there's a level of protection. You're going to protect yourself. You're going to say, actually, I'm not going to be vulnerable out there. I'm going to do what I need to do to survive in this role. And sadly, you can survive in that role, but actually at the detriment of yourself because you're not really belonging. You're not really being yourself. So the journey is actually how do together one as managers, how do we allow our staff to be really themselves? One, as individuals, how do we journey with that? And actually, what is our support network? And in terms of a community of people, is to say it's okay to be who you are and to reaffirm that. And so on different levels, we have to do that in different ways, whether it's the one-to-ones we have, making sure that actually in our one-to-ones, we talk about identity and belonging. In our appraisals, we talk about actually how are you growing in yourself to be yourself? It's a different conversation because we're always talking about outputs and KPIs, which is important. But it's about if we get the best of people, something incredible is about to happen. Guy?
I couldn't agree more in terms of getting the best out of people and learning and growing in that sense. How to be ourselves is a tough one, isn't it? I have no experience of. I come back to this country. I don't have that experience. I don't know what that feels like, and I'm not sure I can say much more than that. So perhaps we could go to the next questions, please.
Okay. I have a question from an anonymous attendee. Chaplaincy has really tested my understanding and practice of inclusion and accepting people as they are for the better. As a people of faith and as chaplains, how can we uphold equality and social justice in our workplace and within our personal lives more? Okay, over to Abdullah.
It's a really good question. For me, I often talk about maturing spirituality, which is really about where are we currently in ourselves in terms of social justice and equality and inequality. Because there'll be certain things which are really pertinent to us because of our experiences. And there'll be certain equality groups that we will be aligned with because we have a want and desire for social justice to be achieved. Now, everybody's experiencing that at a different level. So you're going to have people who are passionate, people who are way back in the line thinking, actually, I don't know if this is for me. And to recognize we've got all of that milieu of people trying to work out what really equality means. And how do we move as a people collectively with all of those realities? Because if somebody has a real strong philosophical, theological understanding of a matter in terms of one of the equality strands, and they have understood this based on their worldview, that is their position. But how they interact with people is one aspect of that reality. And in their interaction of that has to be the highest standard. So we have to have always, for me, I say that wherever you are theologically and philosophically, morally and ethically, across those equality protected categories and human rights areas, it's how we behave to our human brothers and sisters that will actually be more powerful than what we hold in our value system. And there's something about, one, there's the behavior and how we enact that. And then there is the thing of how do we deal with our own inequalities and injustices in our own realities of our own faith groups. Now, that is an internal debate. I think some people would like that debate to be external, so that there is some kind of measurement, but really that has been happening for millennia, from civilization, from the beginning of civilization, that we are coming to things or disagreeing on those matters. But what crucially matters is how we are and how we are with each other, how we honor. And I talk about nobility a lot because nobility, there's a beautiful Latin phrase, nobilis obliges, that nobility obliges you. So what does that mean? It means that we are obliged as human beings to honor, to love, to respect, and to raise each other. Now, that's a very high standard. I fail on that. I fall on that. But I also put my hand up and say, there's going to be times where I fail. So don't count that against me. And how do we honorably say that? Because, you know, there is such a culture of mitigation and risk that actually if we, you know, sometimes admission doesn't mean fault. It just, we're saying actually there are things we're not getting right. And that actually is more powerful than saying, you know, we've got this policy, we've got this, we're doing this. Be honest and say, look, we're not looking after you. We don't know how to look after you. That's the journey. Sorry. Guy?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Abdullah. A very powerful statement there. I think I'm tempted to, in terms of answering the question, thinking about our roots, you know, the roots within our faith traditions. But then you also helpfully said, you know, and pointed out that actually we have all these conversations within our own faith traditions, which are often not very easy, and we find that our debates disable us or find our place, particularly working within equality and justice within the NHS, where our faith community challenges us in a particular kind of way, and we find ourselves possibly potentially departing from our faith tradition because of our desire to embrace equality and embrace justice and equity. But thank you so much, Abdullah. It was a very very, very pertinent and powerful statements. Well, so with the next questions, please.
Okay, a question from Ben. Traditional spiritual belief systems can often, but not always, include stigmatizing ideas towards disabled people and those with mental health difficulties. How do we best deal with the staff who express such stigmatizing ideas as part of their spiritual beliefs?
Okay, so if I understand this question, forgive me because actually I can't read the question. There's 3 parts to that question. Is that right, Guy? Or have you understood it with a few more?
No, I think that's fine. I was talking about traditional spiritual belief systems can be, but not always stigmatizing.
Okay, so what is clear is that is a reality. There is a reality around. We do sadly have those situations, thankfully in small pockets. It's not an experience which is common, but when it is experienced, it is a damning experience because it really challenges the individual who's being cared for. So what is our responsibility in terms of trusts, organizations and spiritual practitioners and chaplains is to raise the game. We not only do we need to have robust supervision on different levels. I talk to my teams around, a minimum of 3-4 levels of supervision. One is the peer-to-peer support reflection and restorative reflective practice. One is the clinical supervision, and then of course your own spiritual directorship, and then fourthly, an organizational mentorship that shapes you around what is it we're trying to achieve. Now, if we are able to put these things in place for each one of us as practitioners, then there's some growth. Now, what happens is if we have a lot of chaplains and teams are smaller, and it's actually we don't have as many large teams across UK and in the world, but actually you find that most of the chaplain teams that we have in the UK are small teams. So if you do experience that stigma, it is it's about how do we as an organization, as patients and chaplains together actually start raising the standards. And there has to be some standards that we have to instill. And there is a challenge out there for us for the UKHBCC. There's a challenge for the HCPCC, and actually each one of us involved, whether we're nurses, clinicians, or practitioners, or to be actually a part and parcel of this of the solution, rather than it's just an onus on a particular professional unit. We can only do this together in real terms, but it has to be done with insight, with thoughtfulness, with compassion, and most of all, with a supportive mechanism. Because otherwise, what happens is it becomes this situation where the perpetrator, in these situations, instead of actually growing, becomes much more bullish in their approach. Sadly. So it's about, there's got to be growth for the individual who's doing that, but there's got to be things in place within the organization that allows for those things not to occur. I don't know, Guy, your thoughts on those?
No, just in terms of looking back at the question there, how do stigma and discrimination can exist within our own spiritual traditions and beliefs? I think that's the dilemma, isn't it? And if we identify and see those in action, I know from my own faith tradition, stigma is often, well, I'll say often, is sometimes present, particularly in terms of mental illness.
Yep. I mean, yep. Sorry, I was just going to say, I see that there's a lot of work now happening in mental health. It wasn't the case before. There is a movement. What I would say is that we all are part of the solution to this, around how do we challenge our own faith communities and what are the things that we can do together. We do need to raise the bar. The challenge we face around stigma is going to be there for new coming conditions as well as present ones. So it's something we're having to deal with for generations, actually, and we are seeing a change and a shift in going forward. It's not where we ought to be, but I think the wheels of change have begun. What I'd like to see is much more support for faith leaders in communities, and actually much more co-production with disability groups across, or equality groups across the board, that are feeding that kind of training and delivery, so that there is much more multiple angle of approach to this, rather than just, you know, taking one issue and dealing with it. I don't know what the answers are. I'm only trying to share with you some of my experiences, but I hope that some of this will be beneficial going forward together.
Okay, I am conscious of time, so
Gosh.
perhaps a couple of more questions. Jeremy has two. So firstly, does the dominant culture define the direction of travel? And secondly, how do we deal with the issues of power as moral and spiritual agents?
Gosh, and I only have a few minutes. I mean, we could write, you know, you could spend you could develop a thesis around this quite easily. Could you repeat the question, please, just for my benefit?
So, okay, so the first one.
Let's start with the first question, yeah, and then we'll deal with the
Does
second.
dominant culture define the direction of travel?
My immediate response is yes, the dominant culture does set the terms of reference for how we go, how we move forward, but that doesn't stop us from actually being involved in the direction. So there's something about, yes, you can have, we're always going to have a situation where there is a powerful group versus the group who don't have power. So how do you engage with that? The whole idea for us, you know, through the classicists, when they talk about Plato's Republic, is the idea of how do you bring that kind of democratic reality to the ground. There's always going to be that challenge, but it's how you engage with that challenge and how you see the challenge not as a challenge in itself, but as an opportunity for you to really develop an opportunity for people to grow. There's something around power isn't really the question. It's about your involvement, because you are the agent of change, whether you see it or not. And if people collectively become the agents of change, something incredible will happen. That's my attempt at answering that. I'm sure Guy has something far more incredible than I have to say.
Okay, and the second one, how do we deal with issues of power as moral and spiritual agents?
Oh God, I mean, you know, we're all on a journey and our life changes in the flash of a moment. How we deal with those moments is going to be the measure that people will respond. People will measure us by our response. So it's really, for us, is about power will always exist in its reality. How do we engage with that power or lack of power is our response. And I am on a forever optimist to say there's a wonderful scriptural verse that I'm going to say, your gifts will bring you, Proverbs, your gifts will bring you in front of kings. Now, if you allow yourself to be yourself, and as Mary Ann Williamson says so aptly in one of her poems, as you shine, you give other people permission to shine. Nothing greater than you being yourself. So power will have its time, but power is only as much as people allow it to exist. Sorry, that's more philosophical than it is practical, but you know, there I am, Guy. Over to Guy.
That's a wonderful, wonderful image. I can't better that, and thank you, Abdullah. That's profound. I'm conscious there is possibly at least one question we could perhaps fit in. Do you think, Safis? One more
question. Okay, another question. There has been debate about whether spirituality means the same thing for different people. From your background, what does spirituality entail if it does exist?
So I'm going to answer this in a very mental health way. It's about being whole. It's about being you. It's about being everything that makes you you, that makes you unique, that everything that brings life and joy to your life even the moments of sadness and grief. All of those things are spiritual elements on the journey. So for me, it's about being well. So when we reverse that, it's well-being, and elements of well-being is you being whole. So what the absence of wholeness is, I suppose, a much deeper question. And I'm going to tie in a friend of mine who wrote a book around Between Health and Sickness, Professor Chris Ward. It's a really interesting book. I recommend a read because he's trying to, one of the things he establishes is actually what is the conversation. We often talk about spirituality as if it's absent from us. But for me, it's core. It's core to the sense of being whole. It's core to everything we do. But if you define it, then you're left to choose essences and qualities of that core. But it is all the qualities and essences of the being make that being. So if that is, for me, if there's one word that could describe spirituality, it's being whole. It's being you, genuinely you. And that is profound, because that means we have to discover ourselves with others journeying on. It's a lonely journey, but many have traveled before it and many will travel after it. Guy?
Thank you, Abdullah, very much indeed. The wisdom that you've expressed and the depth of your understanding is profound. I thank you so much for all that you've contributed. I'm thinking that as we're rapidly coming to the 5 o'clock even, we probably need to wrap things up. But Abdullah, from my perspective and as project lead for the LiSHoRe project, I'm delighted that you were able to say yes to this invitation. You've given us an awful lot to think about, and one of the great advantages of this, of course, is we can listen to it again, which I will certainly do, because there's much that I think I would value from hearing and dwelling on and allowing to kind of percolate, as it were. But I'll hand over now, I think, to Juliet for the final comments.
Yeah, thank you, Guy, for that. Yes, thank you for a very thought-provoking and it felt like a very authentic and heartfelt conversation there. So yeah, thank you again, Abdullah. On the slide now, I'm just putting up the details for the fact that we have 4 more webinars coming up. And for full details of these, go to the web address appearing now. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be Managing the Complexities of Identity with Dr. Ria Patel on Thursday, 16th of December at 4 o'clock. And a reminder that all of our webinars are being recorded and will be available on our webpage. And with that in mind, are there any other final comments, Abdullah or Guy? Do you have anything else?
I just want to thank you, Guy, Juliet, Suffice and Brian, the whole team, one for inviting me for the opportunity. I really, it is, we all bring the best out of each other, and this opportunity for me just, is really about the yearning that people have across the world. They're wanting we're all wanting something, and something is happening. I can't put my hand on it or a word on it, but we are in a time of incredible change. That's my last thoughts.
Thank you, Abdullah. And so just to thank our attendees as well for coming. Thank you so much, and thank you for your questions. If there are any final thoughts or comments, please type them in the question and answer box. We do keep a report of everything you type, so it's really helpful to have your feedback in there. So thank you. And our seminar is now coming to a close. So thank you everyone for coming, and have a good evening.